Today is Sunday, September 17th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Before I get started with today's walk talk, I'd like to celebrate the fact that my wife and I made our temporary promises yesterday as lay Dominicans. And so, more officially, enter in on our Dominican life together with the wonderful chapter that we belong to here in Charlotte. We had a beautiful Mass and ceremony yesterday. Really just couldn't get better. And I thank God for the opportunity to be a lay Dominican and for all that I've already learned through the formation and all the resources that are available. So thanks be to God. Today, it's a Sunday, and I like to talk about religion on Sundays. I try to leave off academic talks and liberal arts or philosophy stuff and spend some time on a religious topic. And today's Mass readings were really so important for the modern controversies that go on in Catholic circles, and that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit. Understanding how to live peacefully and happily as Catholics in the midst of controversial circumstances, especially when we live in secular societies like America, and we're supposed to live with neighbors who don't share our views or beliefs or practices, and we're supposed to live peaceably with all men, as St. Paul says. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we live peaceably with people whose ways of life may be undermining our way of life, or whose mission in this life may be undermining our mission in this life? It's a real challenge, and many Catholics, maybe even most Catholics, just get this completely wrong. And I'd like to look at today's Mass readings and then get into some practical thoughts about how this actually works in real life. So the first reading today was from the book of Sirach in the Old Testament, and I'll just read it here. Bear with me. Now, I should just say one thing. Before I say anything about the book of Sirach, I recommend, if you have an old Dewey Reams Bible, I don't know if the New American Bible provides this, but it explains in the opening lines of Sirach that Sirach is really a commentary on the law of Moses. So it's a practical explanation of the law, and it's presented in proverbial format so that it's easy to memorize and keep in mind. So it's a really awesome source for meditation because it takes us into the law of Moses, into God's law, and gets very practical. When I was a Protestant converting to Catholicism, I couldn't believe how good the content of Sirach was, because as Protestants, we spent so much time trying to find good sources for moral teaching, moral lessons, moral proverbs, and things like that. And the reason why there's this lack of moral teaching like that is because they've taken these books out of the Bible. As you read Sirach, you'll see that Christian etiquette and manners are really drawn from God's law. And Sirach is a book on true manners and etiquette based on the law of Moses. Really an invaluable book. And I remember when I became a Catholic, just devouring the book of Sirach because it was so helpful, so good. And today's reading is an example of that. We read, wrath and anger are hateful things. So all these Catholics walking around angry, pretending that being angry, like Father Altman, angry Catholics, all these angry Catholics have a problem. And philosophically, anger is a passion. It's something that's a part of our nature. But it's always supposed to be ruled over and controlled by reason. And so anger is sort of a natural fuel in our soul, but it's very rarely supposed to be let out because it serves a purpose, which is just to help us pursue virtue. But when we see people lashing out in anger, it's usually because they've lost control of their anger, especially when it's wrathful. Wrath and anger are hateful things. Yet the sinner hugs them tight. And we'll find Catholics today who will try to argue to us that their angry, wrathful spirits are actually good things. They're actually signs of how faithful they are, or they'll refer to it as righteous anger. Whereas they're not the judges of whether their anger is righteous or not. That's the question, not the answer. But we read, wrath and anger are hateful things, but the sinners hug them tight. Sinners love anger and wrath. Anger and wrath are the way that sinners communicate. Not righteous people, not virtuous people, but sinners. No matter what anybody says, as they try to pretend their anger and wrathfulness are somehow virtuous. The sinner hugs them tight, Sirach tells us. The vengeful will suffer the Lord's vengeance. Those who always want to have their way and pay back those who offend them, they are going to be punished by the Lord, because we are not the avengers of the wrongs in the world. The vengeful will suffer the Lord's vengeance, for he remembers their sins in detail. He remembers their sins in detail. When you consider that we as human beings are all sinful, all of us, we may not commit mortal sins, but we are constantly sinning in some way, to some degree, falling short of perfection. And remember, that's the commandment for the Christian life. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That is the command. And we fall short of that constantly. But by the grace of God, through regular participation in the sacramental life, venial faults are washed away constantly. Every time we attend Mass, our venial sins are forgiven. Mortal sins are of such a nature that they destroy grace in us and separate us from God, and we've got to be reconciled after a mortal sin. We don't commit mortal sins casually or stumble into mortal sin. But just because we don't commit mortal sins, I don't commit adultery on my wife, I don't steal from the grocery store, I don't murder people, that doesn't mean I'm not constantly falling short of the command of perfection. And I realize that. And then when I combine that realization with the thought, to whom much is given, much is expected, a person like me who's been given so much is more culpable. I have to account to higher standards. And so when I reflect on those two things, the reality that I fall constantly, and the truth that I've been given much, I'm left in a very humble position, and that should be reflected in the way that I think about others, react to others, speak to others. If I'm conscious of my spiritual condition, I'll be slow to anger, as we're supposed to be. The Lord remembers all of our sins in detail, and that includes not just mortal sins, not just the most extreme evils we can think of, but the constant failure to live as we should, to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, especially as Christians. He remembers our sins in detail. Forgive your neighbor's injustice. Forgive your neighbor's injustice. And then, when you pray, your own sins will be forgiven. This is the same exact thing our Lord teaches us in the Lord's Prayer, which, if we're not somehow desensitized to this, we should be reciting every single day. Every single day we should be reminding ourselves as we pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Well, how do we forgive those who trespass against us? If I don't forgive when people trespass against me, then what am I even saying when I ask God to forgive me the way that I forgive others? To not forgive me? Essentially, that's what we are doing. And our treatment of others, our response to others, simply reveals how God is going to respond to us on Judgment Day, when we're condemned for a zillion sins, and the only chance we have of salvation is to plead for mercy, and God simply answers us with our own words. A good example of this we see in The Christmas Carol by Dickens, where Scrooge in his daily life just answers everyone roughly, like when he's asked to make a donation at Christmas time, and his response is, well, are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? And he just dismisses the requests of the poor for mercy. And then later, when he is shown his sin and he realizes what a terrible state he's in, he asks for mercy, and the spirit of Christmas, I don't know which of the spirits it was, responds to him with his own words. Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? That's what God reveals to us. That's how judgment works. God will simply do to us as we have done to others. Another great example of this principle of judgment, a movie that I recommend. Find Shakespeare's Henry V by Kenneth Branagh. It's a film version. It's a great film version of Shakespeare's play Henry V. Henry V was a Catholic king. There's a great scene in Henry V where three of his closest friends choose to betray him. And so what Henry does is he calls his friends together and presents them with a case of men who've been caught betraying him, and he asks the men what they think he should do. And these men, these friends of Henry's who are traitors, in order to try to show themselves to be so zealous for him, all of which is false, they say that he should be shown no mercy. And King Henry says, no, I think I'll show mercy. And they say, no, they argue against him that he's being too loose with mercy. And then as those words come out of their mouth, King Henry turns around and says to them that they're going to be judged by their own words, and there will be no mercy. Not because Henry has no mercy, but because they have no mercy. So that's the principle that we're being taught here in today's readings. Forgive your neighbor's injustice, then when you pray, your own sins will be forgiven. Could anyone nourish anger against another person and expect healing from the Lord? The answer to that is yes. We see this every day with the critical fault-finding among Catholics. These are people who expect to receive mercy from God and yet are constantly, mercilessly criticizing their neighbors, especially unbelievers, criticism of whom is not even reasonable, and criticize everyone from their unbelieving neighbors all the way up to the Pope himself, presidents, rulers of nations. There's no limit to their criticism. And then they present themselves as poor, innocent little lambs in need of mercy. You just see the disconnect in the way that they think. And Sirach asks, could anyone who expects healing from the Lord nourish anger against another? It's insane. How could human beings whose eternal happiness depends entirely on mercy walk around angry and critical of others? That's some kind of insanity. Could anyone refuse mercy to another who is like himself and then seek pardon for his own sins? Makes no sense. When you sin, don't you realize that you often sin because you're weak, because you're stressed, because you're distracted, because you're anxious, because you're uncertain, because you lack self-control, because life just happens fast and you respond in regrettable ways? Don't you experience that? Well, so does your neighbor. Everyone lives with the same faults, in the same circumstances. You're not the only person who experiences difficulties. You're not the only person who struggles through times of uncertainty or anxiety. You're not the only person who faces adversity. Everyone does. Everyone does. Can anyone refuse mercy to another man like himself? Can he seek pardon for his own sins? If one who is but flesh cherishes, clings to wrath, loves being wrathful, it's just his default mode in how he treats other people, who will forgive his sins? In other words, a wrathful, angry, critical, judgmental spirit is a sign of damnation. If there's any sign that a person is on his way to hell, it's how he responds to the offenses of others. When people do him wrong, how he responds to that reveals the state of his soul, because he's going to be judged according to the measure with which he himself judges. Sirach says, remember your last days. Think carefully about Judgment Day. Think carefully about the hour of your death, when you're going to cry out for mercy. as your only hope of salvation, remember your last days, set enmity aside. Remember death and decay and cease from sin. And notice he's pointing out to us that, while we can talk about sins like stealing and lying and fornication, adultery and murder and so on, he's warning us about the sin of anger and wrath and refusing to forgive and bear with the wrongs of others. He's warning against the sin of being merciless. And then we have this last line of the reading from Sirach, which is almost paradoxical. And it takes real understanding, real spiritual understanding to see how these apparently contradictory things can go together. He says, think of the commandments. Think of the commandments. Hate not your neighbor. Remember the Most High's covenant and overlook faults. I think that verse must cause some people's heads to almost explode. Most Catholics who spend their time arguing against the Pope and the bishops and criticizing society and complaining about everyone and everything, most of them argue that overlooking faults is some kind of weakness. Overlooking faults is owed to cowardice. So if my son, for example, is acting up or does something disrespectful to me and I just move on to the next thing, they like to roll their eyes at that and say, oh, look at that, overlooking sins of another person. But there's more to the Christian life than constantly reacting to everything someone does wrong. First of all, usually the people who do that are people who aren't trying to accomplish positive things. They're not actually trying to do good things. They just define religion as the constant reaction to what other people do. Reacting. What's the headline of the day? How am I going to react to that? What's the new controversy? How am I going to react to that? What is the new sin that's present in our society? How am I going to react to that? But what they don't ever think about is, what positive good are they actually developing? This constant response. Someone comes out with some sinful video, they've got it all shared all over social media. Look at this, terrible, disgusting, horrible, these wicked, evil, blah, 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 blah. They're the ones sharing it. I talk about this all the time. My social media feed has hardly any ugliness in it except the worst videos and pictures and articles that are collected by the so-called righteous Catholics who are sharing them all over social media. If there's some immoral drag queen reading books to kids and there's pictures taken of this person, you'll never see them until some Catholic gets a hold of the picture and shares it all over social media. So who's really the source of this immoral imagery? Most of these things would go unnoticed. If we were focused on good works, if we were focused on positive activities, these people wouldn't be made millionaires because of their sins. We wouldn't be manufacturing celebrities by giving them free promotion all over social media, which you need to pay for as a business. But if you put something immoral out, the Catholics will publish it to the whole world, which generates for these people thousands and thousands of dollars of free marketing. And the Catholics can't understand that their way of life is self-defeating. They're actually enriching the people and activities that they imagine themselves to be fighting against. If they would overlook these things and focus on the positive work that they're supposed to be doing as laymen, directing temporal affairs according to God's will, these things would struggle to even get any attention. There would be local troubles that would come and go and hardly have any influence at all. Catholics make these things cultural sensations. Christians make these things viral videos. That's the short-sightedness of this idle, gossipy reaction religion. But Sirach teaches us that we should overlook the faults of others, and yet at the same time be mindful of the commandments, because the commandments teach us: don't kill, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't commit adultery, on and on. But the commandments don't teach us to attack our neighbors for these things. They don't teach us to go around like undercover detectives trying to find out who's committing adultery and who's stealing and who's lying and who's... They don't send us out into the world as investigative journalists to try to uncover conspiracies. We're told to go into the world and build the church. We're told to go into the world and make disciples. There are positive Catholic works that are supposed to be done, that are not done, by the way. And if we were focused on the positives, which can overcome the evil and often eliminate the sources from which the evils come, we would not only establish good Christian institutions and businesses and schools and all kinds of other benefits. Not only would we positively build good things, but we would consequently destroy the sources of the bad things. I mean, the biggest source of most evil is simply idleness. You can criticize people for doing bad things, but if there's nothing good to do in its place, I don't know what you expect people to do. It's this idle spirit which can be blamed on a lack of good activities that leaves people in a state where they have nothing better to do but sit around and fiddle with nonsense, just like the Catholics are doing, who are sharing all of the juiciest immoral stories they can find on social media. I don't understand how they find them in the first place without seeking them out. It's very bizarre. But we're taught to live peaceably, to be merciful, to model perfect justice, and to overlook the faults of our neighbors. And I know that many Catholics struggle to do this so much that they cannot participate in any positive work. They cannot collaborate with other people to do anything good. They can't. They're tormented by this critical spirit that just constantly finds fault, constantly is offended, constantly is reacting critically to everything others do, and they can't they can't participate in a positive work because this spirit, this sinful anger and criticism and merciless character cripples them. They can't be happy. They can't have friends. They can't participate in an apostolate. They can't enjoy life in the church because of this spirit. And of course, they tell themselves that it's because they're the faithful ones, they're the remnant, and so on. But that's not true. The faithful ones are like John Bosco, building schools, taking kids out of the street and creating places for them to study and live and cultivate virtue. That's what saints do. They don't sit on the internet scouring secular news sources looking for offensive things to share on their social media accounts. They're building things. Mother Teresa goes into the world, finds suffering poor people, and builds hospitals and orphanages and care centers for those people. She positively creates a solution to the problem. That's what saints do. Padre Pio built a hospital. He didn't sit around criticizing the liturgy. He built a hospital, Padre Pio. We look at the saints, and what we see all the saints have in common is that they built something good. They developed something good. They weren't negative. They were positive. And because of their focus on the positive work that they were doing, the positive goals that they were trying to accomplish, they were able to live mercifully and patiently with their neighbors. We often learn about the lives and achievements of the saints, but we do so without any chronology or realistic appreciation for the time that their achievements required. I always use Don Bosco as an example because Don Bosco served the boys and built his ministry over 50 years. 50 years. So you can sit there and watch an hour-and-a-half movie of the life of Don Bosco and say, wow, that's nice. Maybe I'll do that. And you're willing to go put an hour-and-a-half of work into the world to become the founder of some new school. But it's not realistic. It's not realistic. Don Bosco had to figure out not just how to say the right thing or think the right thing. He had to figure out how to practically, in the real world, build sustainable, positive institutions. That's the challenge. The challenge is not to have some idle idea. The challenge is not to throw some words around the room and imagine that you're a genius because you can see the problem. It's like people watching sports on television. Oh, why does this dumb coach, why does he keep running the ball when he could be doing this and that? And, the coach is actually coaching a real team. You're sitting watching a television, imagining that you know more than the coach who's actually leading the team. And you see what a crazy mind that is. People who watch things on television, who just talk about things, they imagine that they would do it better, but for some reason they weren't lucky and they weren't given that chance to do things, and they justify their lack of actual work by blaming it on chance, as if the other people actually doing things have not worked and sacrificed and built careers and built institutions over decades of their lives only to be criticized by Pete in his recliner. What's actually difficult is positive achievement. That's what's actually difficult. And all the excuses you can make. Well, I couldn't do that because I had no money and I couldn't. No, duh. That's the whole challenge. That's the whole challenge. John Bosco didn't own buildings where he could house strangers. Mother Teresa didn't own truckloads of hospital supplies to take care of the poor. That's the real challenge of Christian works. Not just lazily talking about what you would do or what you think should be done, but actually doing it in the real world, in the presence of all of the obstacles, all of the regulations, all of the costs, all of the opposition, and overcoming all of that evil with good to actually build something positive and sustainable in the real world. That's the actual challenge. So anytime I see people criticizing bishops or popes or schools or universities, I ask them, what project are you currently building? And you'll never find any of these people doing anything positive, because people who actually do things appreciate how difficult it is to do things. They appreciate how difficult it is to promote Christian learning, to promote Christian culture, but at the same time satisfy state regulations, at the same time pay to build something that satisfies all of the modern building codes and safety regulations, pay for insurance that's needed, all kinds of costs and difficulties. To actually build a sustainable business or a sustainable school in the real world is the actual work. Not just burping some ideas out about what you think is wrong with other people's works. And so to understand this balance between high standards and mercy, the only person who can understand that is a person who is engaged in actually positively building things. They understand the goals and the ideals and the need for the high standards. They understand that. That's what drives their work. But at the same time, they understand how difficult it is. They understand that it takes time. They understand that the goals have to be pursued patiently with incremental steps. And you've got to be content with what's possible and not just stupidly or childishly talk about ideals that are not possible. And so people who are actively engaged in real-world apostolates, they understand the need to make haste slowly, as the Emperor Augustus famously said. They understand the need to aim high, but to understand that you need to accept what's given to you and take what's given to you and move one step at a time. Now, that disposition, that one step at a time, real world mentality is what makes a Christian person merciful. They understand and appreciate the difficulty of what they're trying to do. They understand how difficult it is. They understand that other people are not going to give them $1 million. They understand that people aren't going to sign up and just jump on board. They understand no one's going to trust them. They understand all these things, and they respect that. Because no one should trust them. No one should jump on board. No one should start writing checks. They understand that. It's true. It's realistic. And so they work one step at a time. One step. And they're respectful to others. They understand the difficulties of virtue. and they build sustainable apostolates in the real world. They overcome evil with real good. And their institutions often take away the sources of evil by making something else, something good, available in its place. And this is what critics don't do. Critics don't do this. People who actually do things, they don't pay attention to the critics. If you watch these coaches at the highest level of college sports or pro sports, they don't care what the armchair experts say. They don't care what the reporters say. The reporters don't understand the details of the game and the strategies, or know all the different players and their abilities and all the different strategies and plays and plans and workings of the reporters don't know that. These dopey people sitting at home don't understand any of that. The coaches know that, and the coaches don't take seriously any criticism. People who actually build things don't listen to critics, because the critics, they don't understand what they're talking about. They don't understand that there are reasons why things are the way they are, and that in order to make them better, other things have to be done. That it's not that the person developing the school simply can't understand that the standards need to increase. It's that if the strictness of assessment is just radically ramped up and the kids all start failing, the parents of the school are not going to respond and say, oh yeah, that's okay. We'll keep paying our private school tuition for our kids to get Fs on their... No, what's going to happen is they're going to lose enrollment. And so you're just going to spite yourself. So there's always a need for prudent efforts to move forward, while at the same time doing so after you've secured your footing. And these ignorant critics all over Catholic social media, they don't understand how to do these things. They think that the people, like the bishops, just don't understand what they learned by watching a YouTube video. They think the bishops don't understand that what was done in the Middle Ages is different from what's done in 21st century America in the church. Like the bishops just don't understand that. The problem is the bishops are actually responsible for living people. Their decisions have consequences. The critics have no consequences because they don't do anything. Many of them barely keep themselves employed, even pay their own bills. Bishops are responsible for the lives of thousands and thousands of people, whole families, elderly and newborns, college kids and working class men. And so bishops are constrained by the real responsibility of shepherding all of their people. They're not dum-dums who can't see obvious problems. But the critics can't understand how to do real-world things because they're just ideologues. They just sit around talking about ideals that they don't actually work to bring to life. And they talk about topics that really they shouldn't be talking about because it's none of their business. They're just like mosquitoes annoying the people who are trying to work and actually do things. And we have to admit, God made mosquitoes. You can't kill them, at least all of them. And so the people who work just get used to working with mosquitoes. They learn how to guard themselves against them when they go out into the garden. They learn how to ignore them. And that's what bishops do. That's what the Pope does. That's what people who run schools, professionals, business owners, they learn to ignore the mosquitoes. Now, this is especially true in political circles. And if you don't know, I'm currently studying a constitution course. And so I've been immersed in some of the history of the Constitution, in its development and ratification, all the debates behind the ratification. And so I've been thinking about a couple of the founding fathers in particular, men who were Catholics who signed the Constitution. There were two of them. One of them was Daniel Carroll from Maryland. He signed the Constitution. And it's really interesting because the ability of a Catholic to participate in that constitutional convention is an example of this spirit that we read of in Sirach 7. This forgiving, patient, merciful, forbearing spirit. Because this spirit is the key to family life, it's the key to political life, it's the key to business, it's the key to education, it's the key to any worldly activity. Because this idea of Christian idealism is not Christian. This idea of abstract Christian idealist thinking is actually not Christian thinking. Real Christianity is incarnate. Real Christianity takes place in time and space. Real Christianity includes real people, real obstacles. Jesus had to go to sleep because his body was tired. He had to eat because he needed energy. Jesus had to carry out his mission within the constraints of human weaknesses and real-world limitations. He had to talk to people who had different impediments standing between them and salvation. He had to introduce things little by little, even to his disciples. There were some times when he shouted down the Pharisees because he knew that it was appropriate for him to do so, and there were times when he completely overlooked faults and acted as if they didn't even matter. And we can see this prudent, realistic, gentle, respectful, tactful way of Christ. That is the only way. That is Christianity. There's no other Christianity. There's no, and we could say, well, what about when he cleared the temple? All right. One day in the 3 years of his public ministry, we read that Jesus, who is God himself in the flesh, which you're not, went into the temple, found people doing things in the temple that should not be done, and drove those people out of the temple. Period. He didn't do that every day. He didn't talk to everyone like that. And most importantly, he didn't tell you that you have the authority to do that. So it's irrelevant. So to say, well, Jesus turned the tables over, what's that got to do with you? Besides, you're not in the temple. There's no one setting up money-changing tables in the sanctuary of the church. So what are you actually talking about anyway? It's just idle nonsense. It's just idle talk. You're pretending that you sitting on the internet criticizing the bishops is like Jesus, the Son of God, actually present in the temple at Jerusalem, driving people doing evil things out of the temple. You're pretending that your behavior is somehow like Jesus, and it's a joke. It's a joke. It's nothing like anything Jesus did. And besides, you do this nonsense every single day, and you're talking about one event in the Gospels. Why don't you talk about the time when Jesus prayed for his enemies and said, "Father, forgive them because they don't know what they do"? Why don't you make that the rule of your life rather than the clearing of the temple? Or how about when Jesus forgave the sins of the woman at the well, or the woman caught in adultery? Why don't you make that the rule for your behavior? Or the fact that Jesus came into the world to die for our sins, rather than sit in heaven and criticize us from afar? Why don't you make the passion of Christ the rule of your life rather than the clearing of the temple? The answer is because you're crazy. You think that you're Jesus walking around as Lord of the temple. It's just cuckoo. That's why sometimes when people write things, I just reply with the word cuckoo, because it's just nuts to think that I imagine myself to be like Jesus clearing the temple when I criticize a bishop. You're nuts. And you can't function in society with this idealist, crazy mindset. When we look to the founding fathers, especially the Catholic founding fathers, and there were few of them because many of the founding fathers were not necessarily anti-Catholic. There were anti-Catholic influences in America. But the founding fathers were explicitly against establishing any religious requirements for elected officials. Thank God. But we see all of these ideas, we see all of this debating and arguing at the time when the Constitution was written, and then when it was debated and eventually ratified. And one thing that's so beautiful about the founding of America, it's really overwhelmingly beautiful, is that the American people, the leaders of the American people, the influential American people, all different groups, there were all different kinds of people in America. They all understood the principle of bearing with one another. In fact, the whole reason we have a republican form of government in America is because the early Americans understood the importance of working one step at a time. When they first established a government in America, it was just a confederation of states, and they did so through the Articles of Confederation. As they began to live under the Articles of Confederation after the Revolutionary War had ended, they started to realize that this was not going to fulfill the goal. It was good, but it's not good enough. We need to make something better. And that's why if you read the opening of the Constitution, it talks about how we're working here to establish a more perfect union. This Constitution is intended to improve this idea of republican government. We're working together to make it better. And throughout the composition of the Constitution and the debates concerning the ratification of the Constitution, the American people were willing to all compromise with one another. They were willing to compromise. They were willing to accept that they couldn't have what they wanted in full, but they were able to recognize that that didn't mean they should vote against the Constitution. They understood that there were essential things needed, and they debated and argued and wrestled, but in a brotherly way, to say, I believe that we should have this. I believe we need this. And the other group would say, no, we don't need that. We need to do this. And they would argue with each other. But then in the end, they would say, look, I'm kind of upset because we couldn't have this. But at the same time, I can acknowledge the fact that the Constitution, as it is better than the alternative. And therefore, I'm willing to accept that my personal views can't be the Constitution, and I'm not so selfish and reckless that I'm going to reject the Constitution because it doesn't give me exactly what I want. The American people were able to understand that the Constitution was better than the alternative. And they approved or ratified the Constitution with the understanding that it wasn't perfect, but it was really, really good. And everyone in some way had to accept some part of their beliefs or preferences or desires. They had to accept that they wouldn't be supported. And they had to accept that for the good of the country, for the good of the whole society. And the American people in the 1700s, they were able to understand the difference between creating something positively good and pursuing their own personal ideals. And that's how the Constitution was made. Modern American Christians don't think like that. They don't think like that. They can't compromise. They can't accept incremental improvements. They can't. And this actually causes them to lose. They don't think, well, I want this, but it's not realistic. I don't want that because it's the opposite of what I believe. Option C here is sort of a halfway between what I want and what my opponent wants. And I need to accept this compromised position because it's the only possible option, and it's an improvement. It's the only real option, and it's better than what will happen if I stubbornly insist on getting everything I want or accepting nothing. And we see that this is the mentality of many American Christians today, that they think it's better to end up with worse policies so that they can boast and high-five all their friends about how they refused to compromise. And all that they did by refusing to compromise was leave things in a worse condition than they could have been. Parents do the same thing with their children. Parents will decide to fight about certain issues, and they will end up having the whole household torn apart and the family separated and divided. They'll have kids that don't even talk to them anymore because of their stubborn commitment to all or nothing. And imagining that is the teaching of Christianity, that that's the Christian way, that God insists that we take an all or nothing approach to every single moral controversy. And it's better for us to lose everything and leave circumstances in far worse conditions than they are, so that we can brag about how we didn't yield on our convictions. And that's just not real life. That's not how Christ lived. That's not how God has ever dealt with human beings. That's not how God deals with us. And it's this stupid, stubborn, self-defeating spirit that's so common among Christians today. And they celebrate their ignorance and exclusion and loss of influence, loss of resources. They celebrate it as if it's some kind of victory of the faithful, when it's really an embarrassing loss that's owed to not living according to the actual teachings of the scriptures and example of the saints. Mother Teresa caused some people to get upset because she used to tell the Hindu people in India that it was good for them to strive to become good Hindus. And while she's there caring for thousands of sick and dying Indian people, some idle critic sitting on a couch in America is critical that Mother Teresa is not being faithful, because she's talking to Hindus and telling them that it's good for them to become a good Hindu. But the difference is that Mother Teresa is actually on the ground trying to make a bad situation better. And she's taking what is given to her. The principles of Hinduism are better than an immoral society. And so being in a Hindu culture, Mother Teresa didn't believe that she should go in there and insist that everyone accept Catholicism without any qualification, or she was just going to pack up and go home. She knew that that would just mean she needs to pack up and go home. And what would that accomplish? She'd spite herself. She wanted to help the people. And here's the difference. Her interest in the people was sincere. She sincerely wanted to help those people. And she knew that in order to actually help those people, she had to move one step at a time. And since Hinduism was their religion, and when we look at the teachings of Hinduism, she could see that there's a lot of good in Hinduism. A lot better than just wild, sinful immorality. So let's take step one and say, hey, be a good Hindu. Be a good Hindu. And then as you learn and practice Hinduism, then we can start to discuss some of the principles of religion, and I can show you a better way, a more excellent way. And I'm going to show you not by shoving a tract in your face or posting on your Facebook page. I'm going to show you by actually living it in front of you. And we're going to compare the consequences of your religion with the consequences of my religion. But she didn't go in and just draw the line and say, you're either on this side or you're out, and then use that as an excuse to go back home, which is what many Christians do. They're just looking for an excuse to go back to their couch. We see the same thing in the life of St. Francis Xavier, the famous Jesuit missionary. Went to the Chinese people, India, China, struggled to have any influence and realized he was asking too much too soon of the people. And so instead of being quote-unquote faithful, he chose to embrace some of their culture, some of their expectations, to compromise and take what they would give him as a first step. And realize that you're not just going to go from point A to point B immediately. It's a more complex process that's going to take more time and patience. And his early missions were all unsuccessful. And the success came later on thanks to his patience. But this is the kind of thing that modern Christians who don't do things, this is the kind of thing that drive them crazy. They imagine that any time someone shakes hands with a non-Catholic, he's endorsing their religion as true. Rather than realizing that, look, if we can't even talk to each other, the evangelization process can't even begin. And therefore we can find some common ground. And again, if these critics who think they're so brilliant would read Thomas Aquinas, they would see that this is what he teaches. You can't argue with someone if there's no common ground. You've got to begin by establishing common ground. And then what we often find is if we find some common ground, we can find that these other people are not faithful to what they claim to believe. That their actual teachings or their actual practices contradict what they claim to be their principles. That's what Socrates famously showed the Greek people. You claim that these are your principles, and yet you actually contradict them in your own life. And there he introduces doubt. The people begin to question. And that's what makes it possible to discuss alternatives. But modern Christians cannot even get past step one because really they're looking for an excuse just to run home. They can't get past step one. They can't even get to that first discussion to learn the principles that the other person claims to hold. Because they're so scrupulous, they imagine that if they say good morning to a non-Catholic, that they're idolaters. And it's just this craziness. The people who criticize Pope Francis for welcoming the Amazonians, they're just crazy people. Pope Francis understands exactly how evangelization works. He establishes relationships with people. He models the Christian way. He acts like a supreme ruler who is afraid of none of his adversaries, but is comfortable, confident. He acts in every way the opposite of how his critics act, who are cowering on, internet forums and social media pages. When do they ever actually interact directly with the people that they criticize? Almost never. Mainly because they're not even significant enough to get an audience with other people. But that's how things are built. And the worse things appear, the lower we have to be willing to go to make that first step, to make the first step. And so when you see these people in modern society, for example, talking about how we need to restore the Latin Mass, you just see how crazy they are. They're crazy. As if modern society is ready to jump onto the Latin Mass. Let's in this secular, materialistic society, let's just install medieval liturgy. It's not realistic. It's not realistic, and that's what they find attractive about that method. You don't have to actually do it. You can talk about it, you can pretend to be faithful, you can high-five all your friends on your little Facebook group page, liking each other's posts, telling each other, yeah, you're faithful, buddy. But the reality is you're not actually doing anything anywhere. The number of Latin Mass parishes is declining, not growing. The numbers are minuscule. And the idea that that's where we should start. You know what this modern, secular, materialistic society needs? It needs the installation of completely contrary, completely foreign, radical cultural changes that have no relation to anyone's life. That's just stupidity. It's not realistic in any way. No saints thought to do that. No saints thought to go into a place, install the opposite of what was present, and say that that's how you should fix society. And really, I believe it's an excuse so that they can continue talking and not actually undertake any material work of building positive things. They can just sit there, complain. Oh, they complain about the church architecture. The churches aren't built nice enough. But they don't build a church. They don't build a nicer church. They just complain about what other people build. They complain about the music. They don't build choirs. They don't build solutions. They complain about what other people do. They don't become priests and improve the priesthood by their own work. They sit there as laymen criticizing the men who have become priests. And the reason why they love this extreme argument, all these extreme positions, is because people who hold extreme positions don't actually do anything. That's why they like the extreme position. That's why they like it. Because it's simultaneously an argument and an excuse. And that's why they like it. If I said to them, you know what? If you really believe that the Latin Mass is the answer, if you really believe that the restoration of traditional medieval Catholicism is what everybody is yearning for, then start a parish. Start a parish from scratch. Buy the land. Pay for the construction of the beautiful traditional Catholic parish building. Sponsor the clergy. Contact the bishop and say, I'm willing to put all the money on the table to make this possible. I want to build the most beautiful traditional Catholic parish, and then go through any obstacle that comes up, overcome every single obstacle that arises and accomplish your goal. And let's see the thing explode and fill with people. You know very well you have zero interest in such a project, and probably zero ability to lead such a project. That's why that project is attractive, because it's just talk and talk and talk with no accountability to any actual work. It's simultaneously an argument that's great for your social media page and an excuse for your actual life. When we look at the founding fathers, and again, men like Daniel Carroll, I think the other Catholic's name was Fitzsimmons. Might have been Fitzgibbon, one of those two. I think it was Fitzsimmons. These two men, these two Catholic men, stood in the midst of a very non-Catholic society and were able to sign off on the Constitution because they understood the importance of taking what you're given and choosing to make things better out of a sincere interest for the good of your neighbors. That's the real spirit of Christianity. If we truly love our neighbor, we want what's good for our neighbor. And if we can't get level 10, we're willing to take level 1 and then begin working for level 2. Those early American Catholics understood that, and that's why they were able to participate and contribute and sign the Constitution. They give us a good example of what real Catholic life looks like. This is what we see the bishops doing. This is what we see the Pope doing. This is what we see local priests doing. They're dealing with the real people, with the real money, with the real resources. They're dealing with the real circumstances and trying to make them better, trying to make them one step better. And the critics, they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything. And that's why it's not, there's no comparison. It's not even worth talking about, because we're talking about real material works in the world versus just a bunch of idle chatter on the internet. There's nothing to even talk about. We have the real work of the real officials and leaders of the church versus this empty hot air on social media. What we need to do is learn how we can help with these real works and try to contribute in some way that just takes things as they are, considers what's possible realistically and sustainably, and makes it one step better. And that's what we're responsible for. We're responsible to make it one step better. John Bosco went out into the street, not envisioning what would happen down the road, although he may have, because he had dreams of these things. But John Bosco went into the road with one concern. His concern was just to help the boys. His concern wasn't to make them priests and bishops, although that was the outcome. His concern was to make sure they had some food so they would stop stealing. His goal was to give them games to play so they would stop fighting. That was his goal. He took what was given and he sought to make it better because he sincerely cared about those boys. People who talk about extremes and ideals, they don't care about other people. They're content to leave everyone in their current state while they talk idly about what they would do if they were, I guess, a living person. But what the saints did was, the saints went into places where there was evil and suffering and false teaching, and they worked out of a sincere love for the people to make it one step better. And then once they accomplished that, they worked to make it one step better. And some of them died at step 2, and that was the end of it. Some of them were able to keep going. And we saw the full development of their works, but that wasn't always true, and it's not our responsibility. Like when I set out to restore classical Catholic studies, I have no idea what the end result will be or how much I'll accomplish, but I don't worry about that. I just worry about every day making the experience and studies of the students who I have access to one step better. And that's all I concern myself with. I want to make their education one step better. And recently, it looks like things are accelerating very quickly, but that's never been my concern. I just concentrate on making things one step better. I don't know what will come of it. I don't know what the end will be, but I don't worry about that. I worry just about what's possible, what's realistic, what's sustainable, what can actually be done, what will actually serve the students and benefit the families. And I just constantly ask myself, how can I make it one step better? If we would learn to live like that, if we would learn to deal with our neighbors like that, we'd be able to be happy, even in the presence of all kinds of contradiction. We could be happy to talk to our neighbor, who's our neighbors who are a gay couple who were married and who are adopting a child, to establish a friendship with them and just seek to help them to become one step better as that friendship develops, as trust is gained, as discussions develop naturally and tactfully in a sustainable, responsible, mature way, to seek to help others become one step better. That's how Christianity really works. Sometimes we're able to make a great leap. Sometimes there appears to be no progress, but the test of our faithfulness is not whether we know the truth, but whether we're willing to do the work, the real world work that's necessary to advance the truth. And that requires us to be patient, to be forgiving, to understand in other people. I mean, I can understand when I think of my own kids struggling to embrace the Catholic Church, I myself struggle to embrace the Catholic Church. I myself have to coach myself through frustrations as a Catholic. Should I act surprised if those frustrations and objections are present in other people? It'd be hypocritical. The same is true of every kind of person we meet. We struggle with the same things. We should be able to understand why others struggle with them. And if we listen to people, rather than just assume we have all the answers, which we don't, if you'd listen, you'd be able to identify what the crucial issues are in people's lives. What are the real controlling, essential ideas or experiences or opinions that cause them to do what they do? And you can pray for them, and you can study and meditate and try to think of helpful things that you can say to sincerely help them, and to be willing to do so little by little, little by little. That's really what it takes. And you can see most people have no interest in cultivating those relationships or doing those works or developing those projects. It's so easy to just pretend to be an idealist and excuse yourself from the real work of the Christian life. And that's why these people will not have their names written on school buildings or businesses or anything else in the world as memorials. Their names are on social media where you can get a free account and type your name in. That's where these people live. And if we want to be something more than that, if we want to be like the actual saints who didn't just have cool profile pictures, but actually had works in the real world with real people that they left behind, we're going to need to actually live like the saints. And we can't do that with a critical spirit that doesn't judge others as men of the same weaknesses that we have, and often with less grace, less benefits, less resources than us. And if we learn to do that, we can start to build some really cool things. But as it is now, there aren't enough Christians who think that way to actually do anything good. And that's why affairs are as they are.